China brokers a key deal with Saudi Arabia and Iran as it steps up its presence in the South China Sea. Alexy Navalny wins Best Documentary at the Oscars, while host Jimmy Kimmel snubs Malala. And for our timeless topic of the day, I am going to discuss how the internationalization of the American university may be one of the factors that has caused its values crisis today. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey friends, it is Wednesday, March 15th, 2023. Please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. Those of you who follow me know that I do 60-second news clips Monday through Friday to give you a brief synopsis of the news. And I'm also trying to step up my video game with regard to other news developments. For instance, yesterday, I gave a brief synopsis of what happened with that Silicon Valley Bank collapse last Friday. Now, before we get into the news, the big story of the day is obviously that China has brokered this key deal with Saudi Arabia and Iran. I want to tell you a funny story from yesterday's episode when I was talking in more detail than I did on my Instagram about the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. I was trying to give you a simple, understandable overview of what happened with the depositors and the loans that the Silicon Valley Bank made to people at low interest rates, what the government and the FDIC is doing to step in. And I share a set here with Dennis Prager, who some of you know I do a show with called Dennis and Julie. It premieres every Monday. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to please watch it. It is truly unique. We talk about everything. And those of you who do watch it know how true that statement is, that we talk about everything. Anyway, I was giving this brief, understandable synopsis of the Silicon Valley Bank as I was filming yesterday. And just a few feet away from me is Dennis's set, and he likes to sit on the set, as he actually is doing right now. Hello, Dennis. And do some work as I'm filming. But he told me yesterday that he was going to try to listen to some of my show. And as I was talking about the Silicon Valley Bank, I looked over about 30 degrees at my dear Dennis, and he was fast asleep in his chair as I was talking about this. I wanted to share it with you, but I also didn't want to encourage viewers to turn it off and run away. But it just shows that Dennis does not like the economics talk. And hey, I'm not crazy about it either, but we've got to understand it. And part of our problem today in our society, not just among American citizens, but certainly among American politicians, is that they don't understand this stuff. So I view it as our obligation to do so. Anyway, I thought you would find that to be funny. Now again, on to the big news story. China has brokered a key deal with Saudi Arabia and Iran to reestablish diplomatic ties and thaw relations. One of the reasons why this is a big deal is because Saudi Arabia and Iran have been mortal enemies in the past. They have been competing with one another for dominance in the Middle East. Additionally, the Iranians are Shiites, whereas the Saudis are Sunnis. Now, Shia and Sunni are different sects of Islam, just as Catholicism and Protestantism are different sects of Christianity, just as Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative Judaism are different sects of Judaism. But Shiites and Sunnis historically do not get along very well because they have differing views about the succession, I should say, of the Prophet Muhammad. Anyway, so Iranians are Shiites, Saudis are Sunnis. That's one of the origins of their historic animosity towards one another. Additionally, they have been fighting a proxy war in Yemen, where the Houthi rebels have been aligned with Tehran, who has battled Saudi forces for 8 years. And during that civil war in Yemen, these Houthi rebels were firing hundreds of missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia. Arabia, which prompted the Saudi leader to say that Iran's president, quote, makes Hitler look good. So it's sort of a colossal understatement to say that they were bitter enemies in the past. But with this new agreement, they have pledged to reopen embassies in the respective countries. These embassies have been closed since 2016, in large part due to that proxy war in Yemen. They have also agreed to exchange ambassadors to each other's country. And according to what the Saudis told Americans, Iran has also agreed to stop further attacks on Saudi Arabia. The bigger deal, though, of this deal isn't so much that these two enemies are thawing relations, but really what's important about it is not so much that it's good for the countries involved, but that it's bad for these countries' adversaries. Primarily, those adversaries are the United States and Israel. So I'm going to go country by country into the nations involved here, the principal actors, and tell you why this deal is bad for the United States and Israel and why it is good for those three nations involved in this agreement. First, starting with the United States. Apparently, Saudi officials did notify President Biden that these talks were taking place. But what's really important here is that China is now stepping into our place as a mediator between two countries who are seeking diplomatic relations with one another. Historically, the United States has almost always been the key power that mediates between two countries. I could list dozens of examples, but just to highlight the most pertinent ones, we facilitated peace deals in the 1990s in Yugoslavia between the Serbs and the Croats and other ethnic groups that were at war with one another in the 20th century. Additionally, we facilitated peace deals between the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. We also facilitated a peace deal between the government of Sudan and the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, which was the rebel group that was fighting in the civil war in Sudan. That peace deal was in 2005. And of course, we have been at the forefront of peace deals between Israel and its surrounding Arab nations. We have brokered deals with Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, with Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, most recently under the Trump administration during the Abraham Accords. So for China to step in here and broker this deal between two major countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, it really is a referendum on the United States' diminishing power. Now, according to the New York Times, privately, President Biden's aides are scoffing at the fact that the media is calling this an international breakthrough. They are saying, it's not really so much of a big deal that China is brokering these relations. But it just shows how little the Biden administration understands about its own incompetence, which seems obvious because incompetent people usually don't realize that they are incompetent. Amy Hawthorne, who is the deputy director for research at the Project on Middle East Democracy, has said, quote, "This agreement is a big deal. China's prestigious accomplishments vaults it into a new league diplomatically and outshines anything the United States has been able to achieve in the region since President Biden came to office." Now on to Israel, which is arguably the biggest loser in this agreement. The Israelis have been courting the Saudis for the past couple of years. They have been hoping, because the Saudis historically have disliked the Iranians, they have been hoping to facilitate an anti-Iranian coalition with the Saudis. Israel, like Saudi Arabia previously, detests the country of Iran. Iran funds the Hezbollah, which is a Shiite terrorist organization that is based in Lebanon that fires rockets and missiles into Israel to try to destroy the country. The Iranians also fund Hamas, though Hamas is a Sunni organization in the Gaza Strip. They hate Israel so much that the Iranians as Shiites, are willing to give money to Hamas if it means destroying Israel. So again, the Israelis have have been hoping that Saudi Arabia could align with them against Iran. So the fact that Saudi Arabia is now pursuing closer ties with Iran is not good for Israel. Over the past few weeks, there have been some talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia, sort of loosely facilitated by the United States. But what Saudi Arabia said is that if they were going to make diplomatic ties with Israel, they demanded from the United States, A, certain security guarantees, B, help developing a civilian nuclear program, and C, fewer restrictions on U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But the United States was not willing to agree to that. On another note, Israel also has been trying to pursue stronger diplomatic relations with other Sunni Arab states. Saudi Arabia, of course, is one of them. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, under the Trump administration, President Trump facilitated the Abraham Accords, which thawed relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. So Israel was hoping to add Saudi Arabia to that list. Also, Saudi Arabia is home to Islam's two holiest sites, of course, in Mecca and Medina. So the Israelis hoped that establishing diplomatic ties with Saudi Arabia could provide a way to make other peace deals with various Muslim countries. Now, Hamas, the militant organization I mentioned that runs the Gaza Strip, has called this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, quote, an important step to unify the ranks of the Islamic people. And the head of the Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, has called it, quote, a positive development. So now that we know why this agreement is bad for the United States and Israel, let's look at the actors of the agreement itself, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China, and see why it's good for those respective countries. Starting with Iran. As I have reported on this show, Iran has seen a lot of political uprisings in the past few months that started in September with the assassination of a 22-year-old Iranian woman, Maya Amini, I believe her name is. Sean, you can check me on that. I know her last name is Amini. She was a woman in Tehran with her brother. She was visiting relatives, and she was wearing her hijab too loosely. And the Iranian morality police, yes, that actually is a thing, unfortunately, saw her and arrested her because, again, she was wearing her hijab too loosely. She was beaten. I got it right the first time. Maya Amini is her name. They held her in captivity. They beat her in a van on her way to jail, and she died of the wounds that the police inflicted on her. This created mass uprisings in Iran, specifically among Iranian women against the Ayatollahs and the government. As again, I reported on the show, you should see my episode where I give a brief history of Iran, brief meaning like 30 minutes, but hey, that's brief for one country. I talk about the Ayatollah's brutal, savage, misogynistic policies towards women in the country. The age of criminal responsibilities for males is 15, whereas for women it's 7. Males can marry up to 4 wives, whereas women can only marry 1 man. If a woman is alleging that a man raped her, she needs a certain amount of witnesses to corroborate her story in court. Otherwise, the court dismisses it. A woman needs permission to seek an education and get a job in Iran. And of course, there is the hijab restriction. Anyway, I am telling you all of this because Iran has seen all of these protests. They actually, a few months ago, temporarily disbanded their morality police, which shows the extent or the efficacy, I should say, of those protests. Also, Iran has been in the news recently because it has poisoned Iranian schoolgirls. So being able to pursue closer diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia and China gives them sort of protection in this international environment where they have been seen as pariahs and condemned by Western countries, including the United States. Also, China gets 40% of its crude oil imports from the Middle East. Iran is one of the countries that is the most rich in oil reserves, and so it is only economically beneficial for Iran to become closer with China, who is mediating this deal with Iran and Saudi Arabia. China promised Iran in 2021 to invest $400 billion into the country in exchange for oil and fuel. So again, Iran is not stupid. They see that China is this big power, a big potential business partner, and they want to do what China wants them to do. Additionally, Iran is trying to militarize. There have been recent reports that Iran has developed enough uranium for an atomic bomb, which is very scary. An atomic bomb is a nuclear weapon. There are two types of nuclear weapons, atomic and hydrogen nuclear weapons. So Iran has developed enough uranium for this atomic bomb. Iran is also getting closer to Moscow to help Russians in the war against Ukraine. They have sent drones. In fact, they have recently opened a drone factory in Yelabuga, Russia, which will provide a minimum of 6,000 drones to Russia against Ukraine. And now they are hoping that China, because China has become such a formidable military power, will help Iran militarize further. So that's why this deal is good for Iran. Now on to Saudi Arabia. Like Iran, Saudi Arabia sees getting closer with China as only economically and militarily advantageous to them. As I mentioned, China gets 40% of its imports, oil imports from the Middle East, in addition to getting those from Iran. Saudi Arabia is also very rich in oil reserves, so China will be able to have more oil from Saudi Arabia, which Saudi Arabia likes because they make more money. Also, in December 2022, China and Saudi Arabia had deals where Xi Jinping was greeted with a hero's welcome in Saudi Arabia. There was this big naval exercise where the naval planes flew overhead with the colors of Saudi Arabia and China to welcome Xi Jinping. And they made some agreements pertaining to economic development, where the Chinese agreed to bring hydrogen energy development to Saudi Arabia, and also, crucially, to build Huawei cell phone towers in Saudi Arabia. Huawei is, of course, the telecommunications giant in China that China uses to spy on its citizens. So the Saudis also want to join what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is an organization that China started a few years ago in order to assert more global dominance. It can't really be compared to NATO because NATO is a more sort of cemented political and military alliance between democracies and Western countries. But the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is sort of a loose China-led form of NATO. China and Saudi Arabia have this mutual agreement where they want to sort of exchange with one another militarily and economically, and they won't criticize each other's actions publicly. For instance, the Saudis have never criticized China on its treatment of the Uyghurs in, of course, the Muslim population that China holds in concentration camps. The Chinese also engage in organ harvesting. It is just beyond evil and sick the way that the Chinese treat those Uyghurs and their other citizens. The Saudis will not touch that, though. And the Chinese also will not criticize some actions that the Saudis do. For instance, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey, that was a Saudi columnist for the Washington Post living in the United States. And the CIA found that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, ordered that assassination. In addition to wanting to become closer to China through this deal. And by the way, just to take a step back, it's interesting because this deal is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But really, the fact that China has facilitated it is so important because each of those countries, more than they want to get close to one another, want to get closer to China. In addition to the China component, this deal is also good for Saudi Arabia because it undermines the United States. As I said, it is a big slap in the face to us that we are not the world power that is facilitating this agreement. And the Saudis have been thoroughly disgusted with the United States, and specifically with our president, Joe Biden. President Biden promised that Saudi Arabia would be, quote, a pariah state after Mohammed bin Salman was found by the CIA to have been responsible for assassinating that journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But then Biden went to Saudi Arabia at the end of last year and begged Mohammed bin Salman for oil because the environmentalists have Biden wrapped around their fingers, and Biden has said that he will not drill and pursue other measures to make us oil independent from Middle Eastern countries. By the way, that has changed. President Biden, as I will report on the show tomorrow, has recently approved an $8 billion drilling project in Alaska, which is just so funny. The guy who has said no drilling, period, no drilling on federal lands, period, is now saying that he's going to do it. But anyway, because Biden has been acquiescing to the demands of the environmentalists, at the end of last year, he went to Saudi Arabia and begged Mohammed bin Salman for oil, so that Saudi Arabia would raise its oil capacity and would export some of that oil to the United States. He also, during that meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, tried to avoid a handshake with him, but then awkwardly fist bumped him, which arguably was more of a friendly exchange between the two than a handshake would have been. And so what the Saudis did is they temporarily agreed to provide the United States with oil. And then just a few weeks later, Mohammed bin Salman said that he was actually going to curb oil production and not export it to the United States, which was hugely humiliating for President Biden. President Biden promised that there would be, quote unquote, consequences for the Saudis, only to back off without imposing them. So Saudi Arabia is loving this. They are sitting in their huge, pristine towers, laughing and celebrating this deal because it is such a slap in the face to President Biden. And then finally, onto the gold medalist of this deal, the one who benefits the most from the Saudis and the Iranians coming closer to one another, is China, the facilitator. Here are the reasons why China benefits so much from this. As I mentioned, oil. He likes to court the Saudis and the Iranians because he gets 40% of crude oil imports from the Middle East. Also, the Middle East has emerged as a key node along China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is where China tries to establish trade routes in different parts of the world, which don't just serve as trade routes, but also serve as de facto military bases and ways for China to surveil other countries. If you look at the Middle East, you can see that it has become a major market for Chinese goods and technology, specifically Huawei, that telecommunications company that I mentioned. It provides 5G networks in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. And also, China loves this, again, because of what it says about its world presence. China in 2022 launched something called the Global Security Initiative, which seeks to, quote, apply Chinese solutions and wisdom to the world's security challenges. This Global Security Initiative has said that it is against, quote, unilateralism, bloc confrontation, and hegemonism, which is, of course, a reference to the United States and NATO. So it shows here that China is trying to replace us as the arbiter, the controller, if you will, of the world order. Also, Wang Yi, who is China's top diplomat, has said that this deal between the Saudis and the Iranians is an example of this global security initiative. And he said that China is going to support the Middle East going forward in, quote, casting off external influences, meaning, of course, the United States. This announcement also comes 1 week after Xi Jinping and another top Chinese diplomat made some brutal, harsh remarks pertaining to the United States. Xi Jinping said that the U.S. was engaging in, quote, encirclement and containment against China, and if the United States didn't change course, it would lead to, quote, conflict and confrontation. So all of these three powers here win. Again, Iran is trying to emerge and seek ties with stronger countries amid its wave of protests and rebukes among other countries. The Saudis are trying to play the United States and China off of one another. They're also trying to stick it to President Biden, and China is also trying to stick it to us and emerge as a world leader. Apparently, there's going to be a broader summit between Iran and the six-nation Gulf Cooperation Council later this year. And it just shows that we should not let China, our adversary, our biggest competitor, get closer to these countries than we are. Of course, it's true that we are also adversaries with Iran and Saudi Arabia. But in the game of diplomatic relations, we ought to be engaging and talking with our adversaries and not just turning our backs to them, because then it gives a country like China a clear road in. Now, on to other news pertaining to China, which of course is related a bit to this agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians. Beijing is building up its power in the South China Sea. The South China Sea, if you're looking at a map of China, it is to the right, and it's that sea that shares with Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. In early February, there was this incident where the Coast Guard of the Philippines approached a small outpost in the South China Sea. They were just conducting sort of regular compulsory surveillance, if you will, of the area, when a Chinese Coast Guard ship approached the Filipino vessel, came dangerously close to it actually, almost hit it, and the Chinese crew shot out green laser beams, which temporarily blinded the Filipino Coast Guard. Also in February, the U.S. military accused a Chinese fighter pilot of flying within 20 feet, which is awfully close, of the nose of a U.S. Air Force aircraft in the South China Sea. Now, the South China Sea, as I mentioned, it is kind of in the middle of all of these countries, so the boundaries of these countries are drawn sort of underwater in this South China Sea. And so there have been disputes where China has said that certain islands belong to them, and they are trying to encroach further to take possession of those islands. China did say in 2015 that it did not intend to militarize the South China Sea, but recent developments have proved otherwise. China has primarily developed in two areas of the South China Sea: the Paracels Islands, which is closer to the mainland of China, and also the Spratlands Islands, which are much further away and closer to Taiwan. So it makes sense why China would want to go there, because they are stepping up the ante with regard to Taiwan. They have turned over 20 islands. Actually, it's generous to call them islands. These are just reefs in the middle of the South China Sea. China has turned these reefs into artificial islands. I'm going to show you a picture right now of Mischief Reef, which again was just this reef in the middle of the ocean. And you can see that from 2015, or I guess starting in 2014, up until today, they have really industrialized and militarized the island. They have turned these islands into military bases that host airfields, surface-to-air missiles, radar systems that allow them to sense what is happening in the area, and it also gives an outpost for China's Coast Guard. A senior naval official of the United States, Admiral Harry Harris Jr., who led the U.S. Pacific Command from 2015 to 2018 during the time that China was stepping up their militarization of the South China Sea, has said, quote, "They," meaning China, "have such a reach now into the South China Sea with sea power and air power that they could obstruct or interfere with international trade." If you look at the way that Biden is handling this, which is nothing, Biden hasn't been doing really anything with regard to this militarization. He would argue that he has established relations with the Philippines to allow the United States to use some of the Filipino air bases, but really that is not so much of a strong effort against the Chinese in this region. If you look at Biden's policies towards China in the South China Sea versus Trump's policies, it is not even close to compare the two. In addition to freezing the assets and imposing travel restrictions on Chinese officials who were responsible for massacring the Uyghurs, and also imposing tariffs on Chinese goods coming to the United States, during Trump's presidency, when China asserted claims in the South China Sea that were in violation of the territorial waters of the 6 neighboring countries, Trump immediately came out and rebuked China. This is in July of 2020. He said that these maritime claims are illegitimate. He said that he would not allow China to, quote, coerce and intimidate its Southeast Asian neighbors. And crucially, President Trump sent 2 aircraft carriers to conduct joint naval exercises in the area. Moments like these, I will tell you, whether you love President Trump or hate President Trump, you've got to admit he was a pretty competent executive, and moments like these make us miss his strength. Now on to a totally different story, which is a bit lighter than this heavy international news. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the Oscars. Sort of a good moment, a highlight I had from the Oscars, and also a moment that deserves our attention. It was when Jimmy Kimmel sort of was disrespectful towards Malala. But starting off with the good news, the documentary Navalny, about, of course, the Russian opposition leader Alexy Navalny, won the best documentary at the Oscars this past weekend. I actually watched this documentary last night, and I encourage all of you to see it. It is just incredible. It follows the FSB plot to poison Navalny in 2020. The FSB, of course, is the sort of operating body in Russia. It's sort of Putin's cronies that persecute his political dissidents. Navalny, for decades, has been an outspoken critic of Putin and his regime. And he got so popular, he started this YouTube channel, amassed millions of followers, that Putin tried to kill him in 2020. They tried to poison him. And Alexy Navalny was so brave that even after he was almost lethally poisoned by Putin, he returned to Russia because he thought it was so symbolically important for him to go back to Russia and continue to resist the regime. That ultimately, though, landed him in prison, where he is now serving a 20-year sentence on trumped-up charges. What is so remarkable about the documentary is the humor and the lightness of Alexy Navalny. They follow him trying to uncover, he's working with a journalist, trying to uncover who exactly poisoned him. And at one point in the documentary, he finds those people who Putin hired and he calls them in the documentary. This is Alexy Navalny on the phone. And the guys, the Russian guys, pick up and Alexy Navalny goes, "Do you recognize my voice? It's Alexy Navalny. Why did you try to kill me?" And the people on the other end of the line are so stunned that he's alive and that he's talking to them that they hang up the phone. And then in another phone call with one of the other people who tried to poison him, Alexy Navalny pretends to be an assistant to a Putin crony and pulls it out of this guy, how they tried to poison Navalny. And this guy on the phone is admitting that they took his clothes from a hotel and they put this poison on them, and that the orders came from Putin. And so Alexy Navalny released a tape of that phone call, and unfortunately that person who tried to poison Navalny, though it may not be unfortunate because that person is a bad person, was killed by the Putin regime. He is no longer to be found. So anyway, it's just an amazing documentary. I'm so glad that he won. It's so important for all of us to remember how astoundingly lucky we are to live in the United States, where we can openly criticize our government, confident that our civil rights are going to be protected. I'd like to play you a clip from Yulia Navalny, who is Alexy's wife, who accepted the Oscar a few days ago.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to everybody here. My husband is in prison just for telling the truth. My husband is in prison just for defending democracy. Alexei, I'm dreaming the day when you will be free and our country will be free. Stay strong, my love. Thank you.
It's amazing the dignity and courage that they are displaying. Yulia there, again, that's Alexey Navalny's wife. On either side of her were Alexei and Yulia's children, Dasha Navalny and Zahar Navalny. Dasha Navalny is actually a junior at Stanford University. Now on to a less heartwarming moment of the night, but nevertheless one that we should discuss. Jimmy Kimmel had sort of a run-in with Malala, of course, who is the young woman who was shot at the age of 15 by the Taliban in Pakistan for advocating for women's education. Thankfully, she sought medical treatment in Europe, and now she lives in the United States part-time and in Europe part-time, and she is an outspoken advocate for women's rights, specifically in Middle Eastern countries where women are treated so savagely. And Malala also won the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't need to explain to you who Malala is. We all know her. So Jimmy Kimmel, the host, tried to have this joking banter with Malala that really just didn't seem to go over well. You can see that Malala's uncomfortable. Jimmy Kimmel tries to make a joke with her, and she just responds, "I only talk about peace." And then there's this movie, Cocaine Bear, which is enough. I mean, that is a segment onto its own, that there is now a movie out called Cocaine Bear, where cocaine falls from the sky and I guess a bear eats it. I don't know. I haven't seen the movie. It just shows you the degradation of our culture. There's this bear dressed up at the Oscars from this movie, Cocaine Bear, and this bear goes up and tries to, again, of course, there's a human inside the bear. It's not an actual bear. But the human dressing up as the bear tries to go up to Malala and like make a joke with her. And it is just so undignified. Let's play that clip.
Your work on human rights and education for women and children is an inspiration. As the youngest Nobel Prize winner in history, I was wondering, do you think Harry Styles spit on Chris Pine?
I only talk about peace.
You know what? That's why you're Malala and nobody else is. Oh, they feed Matt Damon peanut butter on set to make it look like he's talking. That's Cocaine Bear, leave Malala alone. Come. All right, we got to get this guy out of here.
Look how uncomfortable she looks. I mean, it just shows you that we as a society have lost our sense of decorum and respect. The operating word here is dignity. I just referred to Alexy Navalny as displaying such dignity in accepting that Oscar and speaking about her husband's persecution and about her hopes that Russia will become a free state. Malala exhibits such dignity when she doesn't respond to Jimmy Kimmel's weird joke that I don't even understand and just says very politely, "I only talk about peace." But really, for this Cocaine Bear to approach this woman who was shot by the Taliban, who has won a Nobel Peace Prize, who is an outspoken advocate for women's education, and try to accost her or make some joke, it's sickening. It is truly sickening. The Daily Wire had an article about this where they called Jimmy Kimmel, quote, "a national disgrace," and I will have to echo that. Now on to our timeless topic of the day. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the decline of the American university, because I sort of had an epiphany about the American university. A lot of conservative commentators talk about what has happened to higher education in the United States. It used to be a hub of intellectual enrichment and, crucially, intellectual diversity, and now it is descended into wokeism and chaos. There are so many examples of this. I even saw it at Harvard, where I just graduated from about a year ago. All of these examples of students being shouted down in classrooms for deigning to think for themselves, as Clarence Thomas would say, for challenging the orthodoxy. During Israeli Apartheid Week, which is enough of an example of the wokeism at Harvard, there was this display in Harvard Yard where there was an upside-down American flag with bullet holes through it. So anti-Americanism has just pervaded American universities, and it always fascinates me to think about why. One of the reasons that I have put forward is that universities are sort of uniquely attract progressivism and fuel and foster progressive ideas, in large part because of its emphasis on novelty and critique. I can tell you from my educational experience, which for the record was not all bad. I actually really loved Harvard. I made so many great friends there. I did have many professors there, but still there are a lot of problems with that university and others. But in college and even in high school, what I've noticed is that teachers focus very much on rewarding new ideas as opposed to rational or well thought out ideas. This is especially on display in English classes or in history classes where you get points for participation. And I just remember sitting in the classroom and everyone is trying to get their participation points and they're trying to just come up with, frankly, BS. They're trying to just say something seemingly novel and original to curry favor with the professor and get those participation points. So having a new take on the book that you're reading or about the historical event that you are looking into, trying to figure out a new angle, a new social commentary, a new political or gender commentary, that's sort of what is rewarded primarily in our educational experience in America today. And relatedly, critique is also rewarded. So many of my essay questions, again, both in high school and college, were centered around critique the way that Nathaniel Hawthorne uses imagery in The Scarlet Letter, or critique or make an intervention about the way that the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. Everything was about making an intervention, coming in with your disruption of the norms. And if you look at those two things, novelty and critique, those are the ingredients in progressivism. Progressivism is nothing if not novelty and critique. The defund the police movement, it's new, it's disruptive from the past, and it's a critique of the existing system. Coming up with pronouns and saying that there are multiple genders, that gender is fluid, that's new, and that's a critique. So that's one of my hypotheses for why progressivism has such a home in universities. But again, I had this epiphany that there's actually another big development that has happened in the past 30 years that has facilitated the leftist takeover of the university. And this is the subject that I'd like to speak with you about today. And that is the internationalization of the university. American universities used to be places, that had primarily, almost exclusively American students and American faculty, and also they were places where you learned how to be an American citizen. No longer, and this really started in the 90s with this push towards globalization. If you look at the student bodies of American universities, the international or foreign constituent of students has increased hugely over the past few decades. According to the U.S. State Department, enrollment by international students rose 4% to 948,000 in the 2021-2022 school year, compared with 914,000 in the previous year. That's amazing that we have close to 1 million foreign students here at our universities in the United States. The Georgia Institute of Technology is one of the biggest universities that hosts international students. They enrolled 8,040 foreign students in 2021 to 2022, which was up from 42% the previous year. By the way, again, these are numbers from 2021 to 2022, which was in sort of at the end of the lockdowns in the pandemic. So it's amazing that the number of enrollees of international students increased during that period alongside these policies, which actually made it harder for international students to travel and attend university. There's been an uptick in foreign enrollments across all academic levels, not just at universities. According to the Institute of International Education, they took a survey of 630 schools across the United States and showed that total international enrollment rose 9% in 2022. International students at U.S. schools contribute to $33 billion of the U.S. economy. That was in the 2021-2022 school year. And actually, we, the United States, are the most generous with our foreign visa to Chinese students. If you look at the numbers from 2020, we awarded over 382,000 foreign visas to Chinese students. That is the most out of any country in the United States that awards visas to Chinese students. That's twice the number of the second place country, India, that had about 207,000 foreign visas to Chinese students, and over 5 times as many as the third place country, South Korea, that awarded 68,000. So the student body has changed a lot at these American universities. It's become, in large part, more international. And also, universities themselves have gone overseas. If you look at Harvard Business School, for instance, Harvard Business School, starting in the early 2000s, developed 9 global research centers in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, Paris, India, Dubai, Istanbul, Tel Aviv, Buenos Aires, Mexico City, and Sao Paulo. Okay, so that's in the Asia Pacific, that's in Europe, that's in South Asia, that's in the Middle East and North Africa, and in Latin America. That's huge. I mean, for HBS to go from being just an American university to now being an international university, that also changes the institution itself. And I'm just giving you that number from HBS because it's the most famous example. But if you look at other prominent universities, whether it's the University of Virginia or other Ivy League universities, or even state schools in California, they have campuses. Some of them have campuses, but they certainly have research centers and offices in places around the world. So if you think about it, if the student body is becoming more international and the universities themselves are becoming international, the audience, the people who run the university are changing. And that means that the university is no longer about being a place that teaches you how to be an American citizen, that fosters and sort of passes the baton on to students to carry on American values. But now the audience that they are teaching to has changed. So they now think that it is imperialist to teach students only about Western civilization or only about America, because international students may not want to hear about Western civilization or America, or they may come from countries, or they do come from countries that subscribe to a different value system. This push really started in the 1990s, most famously in 1988 when Stanford University got rid of its Western civilization requirement for freshmen. The phrase, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go, was made famous at Stanford among the student body, protesting that it was so evil to make students take Western Civ. Also, during that same time, the number of conservative professors and liberal professors became way skewed towards, of course, liberal professors. Harvard reported that in the 2021-2022 school year, only 4% of their faculty identified as conservative. That means 95% of their faculty identify as progressive. And progressives, it doesn't mean that all of them don't like American values or don't like Western civilization, though that's kind of dubious because a lot of them don't. But overwhelmingly, progressives are the ones that want to sort of progress away from those things as opposed to wanting to conserve them. So we see that this push for teaching students about Western Civ and about America has changed. And alongside that, there has been an importation of new values to accommodate this internationalization or globalization of the university. According to the Open Syllabus Project, Karl Marx is the most cited intellectual figure at universities these days. And we see that Karl Marx used to be really only discussed in the economics department as providing an example of an alternative or proposed economic system. But now Karl Marx has moved into the history and English departments. So it's become sort of more integrated, not just as an economic alternative or proposal, but as a social, cultural mindset. The university also became many things to many people. Again, it wasn't just about fostering American values. Now we see that the university has colleges of arts and sciences, they have business schools, they have XYZ studies programs. They have gender studies programs, African American studies programs. They have probably botany studies programs. If you look at the list of all of the things that these universities offer, it's just laughable, because there has been this importation of values and this idea that if you are focusing primarily on Western civilization, that you are not giving the full educational experience and you are being imperialist by forcing your values onto someone else. But in reality, regardless of the fact that there are international students at American universities, we need to remember that it is primarily an American university. For the record, I am not against having international students at universities. Some of my best friends from college are international students. It's very important to expose American students and international students to other people across the world, other perspectives, facilitate friendships across international lines. I never thought that I would be friends with people from the parts of the world that some of my friends are from. So in many ways, it is a good thing. But again, American universities are American universities, and there is nothing wrong with primarily teaching American values, just as if you would go to a university in China or in India or in the Middle East, if they would allow you, or in Latin America, they would probably primarily teach you about their culture and their country, because that is where their location of the university is. There's also the Roger Scruton argument that is a final note I'd like to share with you. He argues that Western civilization is ours, and we should love it because it's ours. Of course, we should love Western civilization because it has been the most successful civilization. It has been the one that has afforded the most human rights to all types of people, minorities, not just ethnic minorities, religious minorities. It has really been the beacon of hope for the rest of the world. Not always, but Western civilization has led the way as far as human rights. But even on top of that, as Roger Scruton says, you love it because it's yours, just as you love your home because it's yours. You love your neighborhood because it's yours. It's something intrinsic in you. And he says that you can't destroy the DNA of your culture any more than you can destroy the DNA of your own body. It's a part of you, and it's something that you have an obligation to embrace and understand. I hope that you enjoyed this episode today. As a reminder, please like, comment, and subscribe to this channel, and follow me at Julie R. Hartman. And remember that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. See you tomorrow. Take care.